Hi there, Clem.
Hello, good day. Good morning to you.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah.
So basically,
Mm,
I'm writing a report on South Africa, and it would be great to hear some of your opinions on how the industry is doing, where it's come in the last 20 years or so. Because I've heard from a few producers that they think it's really picked up in about the last 15 years.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and where do you think it's heading, and also how the last couple of years have affected it with COVID and everything?
yeah. I mean, I think that it's a really good question because it kind of ties into the unknown nature that many people have of South Africa overseas. I pretty much entered the wine industry about 20 years ago, so 2003 it was my first vintage. Um, and for sure, at that time, South African wine had been very kind of isolated from the rest of the world for a long time. Winemakers couldn't travel, couldn't, go and work in other countries very easily. We had very few international wines we could taste. So our winemaking was quite isolated. And then after 1994, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the things opened up very quickly. And I think for 10, 15 years or so, South Africans felt that we had to kind of, I suppose, like imitate the great wines of the world to make an impression. So, try and make a great Bordeaux blend or, that kind of thing. So for a while, we were kind of just, I suppose, feeling the waters and not exactly sure how to present ourselves. Maybe we didn't have a lot of confidence, I suppose. And chenin is a great example. I remember when I started getting into wine in the 90s, the best chenins were like super oaky. The winemakers were trying to make them taste like Burgundy. Or they were trying to make them taste like Vouvray. So they were leaving a bit of sugar in them because they thought great chenin had to be, like Vouvray. So the wines were interesting, but they weren't really authentic. They weren't South African because they were trying to be something else. And I think what happened in the early 2000s is winemakers realized, it's all great and well to make really nice wines that taste like something else, but there was this kind of desire to be authentic and South African. And that's I think what's really happened the last 15 years is we're not trying to make other wines. We're just trying to make South African wines or Stellenbosch wines or Swartland wines. And that's, I think, what's super cool because we're not picking overripe or over oaking the wines or manipulating them to be like Vouvray or Bordeaux or whatever. We've got these amazing old vines that we're making and letting them be themselves through obviously very good winemaking, but winemaking that has a nice transparency to it. And so I think that's what's really cool the last 15 years. And it's kind of started where we are in the Swartland, with the Swartland Revolution. We were a group of 4 winemakers who were super passionate about that, and really focused extremely on it and communicated with each other about what we were doing and the kind of techniques to make wines that way. But it quickly spread into other places. So Stellenbosch is extremely interesting. Himmel and Arde, there's lots of regions that are focusing on what works for them rather than how can I make my wine taste like some other wine. so that, I think, and that people are starting to realize now, when we go to New York or London, the top sommeliers there are super aware of that. And they're, we go into 3-star Michelin restaurants and the sommeliers like high five us, they're so excited to see us. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, you would be, I've got, South African wine to taste. And they'd be like, oh no, sorry, I'm busy or I've got an appointment. Or, so that's, it's exciting to see how it's being received. Yeah.
And some of the old vines, so in particular Chenin Blanc, and even maybe some Syrah. How old would you call old vines in South Africa? Because that changes over the world. And how did people decide where to plant these varieties if they were sort of testing the waters to start with? Was it kind of just lucky that they decided to plant these specific varieties in those terroirs?
Yeah, good question. So old vines is now a recognized category in South Africa, like basically legally recognized, and the age cutoff is 35 years. So any vineyard that's older than 35 is recognized as old vines. There's not a lot of red varieties that are old vines, so it's mostly white varieties: Chenin, Palomino, Semillon, Claret Blanche, those kind of varieties that were traditional in South Africa. There is a little bit of Grenache Noir. There's some Cinsault and a few other parcels of red varieties, but it's mostly white. And that's kind of just to do with the history of South African wine. 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, white wine was huge in South Africa. And also distilling was massive. Making brandies, sherries were also very, very important. So we've got this huge history and heritage of old vines, white vineyards. So yeah, it's mostly whites, but there are a few amazing old red wine parcels as well. I suppose it is a little bit lucky in terms of the fact that they're there. They were planted. They weren't in, a lot of them were in the Swartland, for instance, which wasn't a fashionable region. It was a bulk wine region. So these varieties were planted to make wines often in bulk. So 30, 40, 50 years ago, the wines were not extremely special, but I think it was lucky that they were left in the ground, because in the 90s, when South Africa opened up, people did have a lot of Chenin and other varieties that they ripped out that were maybe 20 years old to replant Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, that kind of thing, in the more fashionable places like Stellenbosch, Franschhoek, Constantia. So a lot of that heritage was lost, but in the unfashionable places like Swartland, they were just left in the ground because the farmers were just they were making bulk wine. So in a way, it is lucky that they are still there. And that's what we recognize when we moved to the Swartland. We moved there because we knew there were these amazing vineyards. Ibn Sadi was the same, Adi Bardenos was the same. So we knew there were these amazing old vines that were being used to deliver to the co-op. The farmers were not winemakers, they were just farming the grapes. So for us, it was at that time relatively easy to just move there and go and speak to the farmers and find out which were their best parcels and just lease those parcels and make wines from them. So we could kind of identify the best little spots and focus on making wines just from them. So we could very quickly make amazing wines because they were old. We could focus on the special terroirs, and yeah. So
that's really interesting that those vines were almost not by accident, but just left there because they were unfashionable regions. And then
yeah, exactly. So if it was more fashionable, they would have been taken out also to plant Cabernet and Merlot and yeah. So
do you have an opinion on what? Obviously, it's such a varied country with all these different regions, different climates. There's a lot of warm climate regions, but cool climate regions. Do you see any? What varieties do you see really shining going forward? So obviously, Chenin is one of the top wines that we've been tasting. We've also been tasting a lot of really great Chardonnays as well. And as for red, Syrah seems to be doing really well, and obviously Cabernet Sauvignon is enjoying a lot of popularity. What varieties excite you the most at the moment that you think the new generation are discovering now?
So I think the one thing is also South Africa. In South Africa, you can go from Cape Town pretty much in 2 hours. You can get to pretty much all the wine regions. If you go north, east, or northeast, you get to pretty much all the wine regions pretty quickly. So it's not a huge geographic area, but it changes very quickly because we've got two oceans. On the west coast is very, very cold. On the southern coast, it's much warmer, more humid. We've got these two mountain ranges that really dramatically affect the landscape and the terroir. So the wine regions all very, very different from each other. So Swartland there is obviously more Mediterranean, warmer, drier. So there the varieties that work on Mediterranean grapes, Grenache, Syrah, Stellenbosch closer to the ocean. I suppose it's it works extremely well with Bordeaux varieties. And then you go into the mountains. Elgin is very cool. It's high up. So their Chardonnay starts doing really well, as it does in Himmel and Arda with Pinot as well. So I think also within South Africa, what's happening now is the regions are also focusing on not just making wines that are transparent, but also from varieties that are best suited to their region. So I think the one grape that kind of works almost everywhere is chenin, because it's a very versatile variety. It's got so much acidity, and it works well in very sort of lean, linear styles. It makes more textural styles in our region. You can make sweet wines, that kind of thing. So chenin kind of works whether you're in Stellenbosch or Swartland or all over. But other than that, the regions are very much focusing. So in Swartland, don't try Cabernet or Merlot or Chardonnay. Definitely, Mediterranean varieties and including not just French, but, the Spanish or even now we're working with planting Greek varieties. So, then Stellenbosch, definitely it's the kingdom of Cabernet. The cabs there are incredible. Cab Francs are extremely exciting. So, the regions are starting to develop identities for what they do well. Yeah.
Where do you see it going forward? So we really enjoyed tasting some of the top producers, but there seems to be still quite a vast range in terms of, let's say, quality. How long do you think it would take for the country as a whole to really be recognized for full potential?
Yeah, I think at the moment in South Africa, I think there's about 600 producers, so maybe 700. I would say at the moment, 10% of those are fantastic. So 60, 70, you are making insanely amazing world-class wines. So often they're very small and you need to come to South Africa and we'll tell you where to go. So there's a nice chunk of really exciting, dynamic producers that are doing amazing things. And a lot of younger guys who are just getting going. Their wineries are 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, making very focused. They've all studied winemaking. They've traveled. They've worked at top wineries all over the world. So there's an amazing core of really exciting producers. And then obviously, there are the older school traditional guys who are just doing what they've always done, and they mostly sell their wine locally, maybe export a bit. So that there is a mix, but I think that's in all countries around the world. So I'm very excited. I think that there's a lot of potential. It's just getting better and better and better, and the standard is getting higher and higher and higher every year. When we first released our wines, we were easily at the top, and now every year it's like, oh geez, I speak with Andrew and we're like, we really got to lift our game, because it's so competitive, but in a good way. So I'm very positive, very excited about South Africa.
Yeah, amazing. And the last 2 years with COVID, obviously it's been a bit challenging for the alcohol industry in general. But a couple of other producers that I've spoken to have said, actually, it's been a good time to sort of knuckle down and focus on your actual production.
Yes,
and there
definitely.
have been benefits to it. How has it affected Mullineux?
Yeah, no, that's completely right. Initially we were all extremely stressed. Luckily, South Africa is quite a strong export country because we don't have a huge domestic market. We're quite strongly export focused. So in a way, for a producer like ourselves, sales weren't necessarily badly impacted. Obviously, there were a few issues with shipping, that kind of thing, but we were forced in a way to not travel, to stay at home. And so it's been a lot of focus on the vineyards, on things at home in the winery, our family. So there have been a lot of changes. We've had to adapt and change the way we work a little bit. But I would say in hindsight, it's when we look back in 10 years' time, it's going to have been it's going to have had good impacts or good influences on what we do. But having said that, it is an important thing to travel and get new people to taste your wines, and so I think it's not something you can ignore. We're when I've been to Hong Kong, I realize how unknown South Africa is, and it's important that we get our wines in front of people and just get them to taste them and realize how good they are. So We can't sit at home and do nothing forever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
That kind of ties into one of my other questions, which is about pricing of South African wines.
Yeah.
But in your opinion, where do you think South African wine should compete on the global market? At what sort of price point? Because I guess it has done really well at the sort of lower price point, but then it might get sort of stuck in that perception of very good value, lower price wine.
I think it's like any market. We should have. It depends on the producer. We should be in all different price points. So there are a lot of people who make big volumes of wine, and their wines will be at the lower price points. But for sure, we need wines that are selling at hundreds of dollars as well. And I think that's the challenge is again getting people to accept that South Africa is not just about value for money, lower price points. So yeah, and I suppose we and a handful of other producers are kind of at that cutting edge. So we do sometimes get a bit of resistance on it, but it's okay. We're not making millions of bottles, so we just need to find those customers who understand us. And normally it's just a case, as I said just now, of just getting the wine in front of people, just get them to taste it, and as soon as they do, they buy it. It's sometimes difficult to say, buy my wine if they haven't tasted it. They just see the label and the price, they go, okay. But as soon as people taste them, they love them. So for sure, I think we do have an issue at the moment where a lot of our wines are at lower price points in South Africa, and it's changing for sure. I mean, when we first released our Syrah in London in 2009, it was priced at a nice Creux Hermitage price, and that was the limit. They were like, you cannot price your wine higher than Alain Graillot. There was like, and so we did, and it's sold. But we subsequently released our single terroir Syrahs, which are 4 times that price, and we can't supply enough of that. So it's taken 15 years, but it's changed very, very strongly. So yeah, we just need to do that in other markets as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure. So for that reason, travel is really important for you to get out there and show people your wine so they can taste them.
Yeah, and what you guys are doing is introducing it also, giving a stamp of approval. So that's critical as well. Yeah.
And
so thank you.
Yeah, of course. And just to wrap up, what do you think are perhaps the biggest challenges going forwards for producers?
Look, in South Africa, I think there's 2 things. Obviously, we are a warm, dry place, well, especially where we are in the Swartland. So climate change is an issue. Getting warmer, getting drier. We went through a massive drought the last 5 years, and I think that taught us a lesson about farming, how important it is to be farming more naturally. The vineyards that we farmed, that were farming very naturally before, kind of cruised through the drought much more easily than those that weren't. Using cover crops, mulches, composts, that kind of thing. So that's really brought that home to us, and so it's a huge focus of ours and a lot of other producers in the area. The other thing, obviously, is, as I mentioned, is experimenting with new varieties. So, using grapes like Assertico for our white blend, to bring acidity in are going to be important, I think. So that's the one thing, is adapting to climate change, because we do have already quite an extreme climate. The other thing, obviously, in South Africa is always the kind of the political future. There's always a bit of uncertainty. We've got an amazing president at the moment. He's got his hands full dealing with COVID, but it's always, if you look 10 years down the line, it's always a little bit gray. Like, where will South Africa be? So I think that's the other thing. And tied in with that is we do have issues, like social issues, with very bad levels of education, and so often it's on the producers themselves to educate their workers and to train them and uplift them properly. So that's I think, yeah, a very important part of it is we as a producer, as a company, we don't just wave our employees goodbye at the end of the day. We've got to look after them, and that's I think also really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. That was really interesting.
Cool.
Thank you for getting up so early to talk to me. Really appreciate
No problem. Yeah, good to meet you. And yeah, like I said, I look forward to coming to the restaurant also and seeing you guys in person.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Cool. All right. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.